August 15, 1944. The transport truck rattled down a red clay road somewhere in rural Georgia, carrying cargo that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. 32 German women, members of the Wehrmacht's Auxiliary Corps, sat in tense silence as pine trees blurred past the canvas sides of the vehicle. They had been captured in France during the Allied advance, processed through camps in England, and now found themselves deep in the American South, a place none of them had ever imagined seeing, except perhaps through the sights of a rifle. Elfriede Richter pressed her face close to a gap in the canvas, desperate for air in the oppressive August heat. At 24 years old, she had served as a communications officer, proud of her work coordinating supply lines for the Reich. Now, her gray auxiliary uniform clung to her back with sweat, and her throat felt parched from the relentless humidity. This heat was nothing like Germany. It wrapped around you like a wet blanket, making every breath feel like drinking warm soup. Beside her, Waltraud Schmidt gripped the wooden bench with white knuckles. The 22-year-old nurse had tended German soldiers on the Eastern Front before her transfer west. She had seen horrors that still haunted her dreams, but nothing had prepared her for the uncertainty of captivity in enemy territory. What would the Americans do to them? The propaganda they had been fed painted American soldiers as barbaric, particularly those from the rural South who were portrayed as backward and violent. The truck lurched to a stop, and the canvas flap was thrown open. Blinding sunlight flooded in, and with it came a wave of heat that made several women gasp. A voice drawled in accented English that sounded nothing like the crisp British English they had studied in school. "All right now, ladies, welcome to Camp Gordon. Y'all step on down carefully. It's mighty hot today." Elfriede was the first to climb down, her legs stiff from the long journey. She found herself facing a tall American sergeant with kind eyes and a weathered face that spoke of years working outdoors. He wore his uniform with casual ease, his cap pushed back on his head in a way that would have earned a reprimand in the German military. Behind him stood several other guards, all watching the arriving prisoners with expressions of curiosity rather than hostility. "Name's Sergeant Otis Pruitt," the tall man said, speaking slowly as if he understood they might struggle with English. "I know y'all must be tired and thirsty. We're going to get you processed and settled. Anybody here speak English good?" Elfriede stepped forward, her throat tight. "I speak some English," she managed, her accent thick but her words clear. Sergeant Pruitt's face broke into a smile that completely disarmed her. "Well, that's just fine, miss. Just fine indeed. Y'all are going to be all right here, I promise you that." The processing took place in a wooden building that seemed to radiate heat like an oven. Captain Raymond Booker, the camp commander, sat behind a desk fanning himself with a manila folder while Nurse Mildred Tate recorded information about each prisoner. The captain spoke with the same slow, melodic drawl that Sergeant Pruitt used, his words stretching out like taffy being pulled. Elfriede found herself leaning forward, concentrating hard to catch every syllable. "Now, Miss Richter," Captain Booker said, consulting the papers before him. "Says here you worked in communications, that right?" Elfriede nodded stiffly, unsure how much information she should reveal. Everything about this situation felt wrong. The captain wasn't interrogating her with the harsh efficiency she had expected. Instead, he seemed almost conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than her role in the German war machine. "Well, that's fine. We could use someone with language skills around here," he continued, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. "You speak any other languages besides German and English?" The question caught her off guard. "Some French," she admitted. "A little Polish." Captain Booker made a note and smiled. "That's real good indeed." Behind Elfriede, the other women waited their turn, whispering anxiously in German. Waltraud stood with Irmgard Neumann, a 21-year-old clerk whose hands trembled as she clutched a small bundle containing her few possessions. Krista Bergman, a radio operator, kept her face carefully blank, but her eyes darted around the room, cataloging exits and potential threats. Adelheid Wagner, at 23 the group's translator, listened intently to every English word spoken, filing away phrases and intonations for later analysis. Private Hobart Lee, a gangly young man who looked barely old enough to shave, was assigned to escort the women to their barracks. As they walked across the compound, he kept up a steady stream of cheerful commentary that none of them fully understood. "Y'all are gonna be in Barracks C. It's got good shade from them oak trees, so it don't get quite as hot as some of the others. We just put in new screens on the windows, too, keep the skeeters out. My mama always says a good screen is worth its weight in gold come summer." Elfrida translated what she could for the others, but much of his vocabulary escaped her. What were skeeters? Why did he keep saying y'all instead of you? And why, in God's name, was he smiling at them like they were guests rather than prisoners? The women exchanged confused glances, their military training providing no framework for understanding this strange, casual kindness. The barracks turned out to be a long wooden structure with rows of iron beds covered in thin mattresses. It was sparse but clean, with white walls and those new screens Private Lee had mentioned covering the windows. What shocked the women most was what waited on each bed. A folded towel, a bar of soap that smelled faintly of lavender, and a pitcher of water with actual ice floating in it sat on a small table between every two beds. Waltraud touched the ice with a trembling finger, watching the cold condensation on the pitcher. "This is for us?" she whispered to Elfrida in German. "They give us ice?" In the camps they had heard about, in the stories of Soviet captivity that had terrified them all, prisoners received nothing but cruelty and deprivation. The first week passed in a haze of heat and confusion. The German women followed the camp routines mechanically, rising at dawn, attending roll call, performing assigned duties in the laundry and kitchen, and retreating to their barracks when the afternoon sun became unbearable. They spoke little to their captors beyond what was necessary, maintaining the dignity and discipline that had been drilled into them during their service. But everything about this place contradicted what they had been taught to expect from the enemy. It was on the 8th day that Sergeant Otis Pruitt approached their work detail with a wooden crate that clinked as he set it down. The women were hanging laundry on lines stretched between oak trees, their hands red from the hot water and lye soap. Elfrida noticed him first, and her posture automatically stiffened. The other women followed her lead, standing at attention even though no one had given such an order. "At ease, ladies," Sergeant Pruitt said with that easy smile of his. "Y'all have been working mighty hard in this heat. Figured you deserved something special." He opened the crate and began pulling out glass bottles filled with dark liquid and strange round objects wrapped in cellophane. "Now, I don't know what y'all had back in Germany, but down here in Georgia, when it's hot and you need something to pick you up, there ain't nothing better than a moon pie and an RC Cola." The women stared at the offerings with suspicion and fascination. Waltraud leaned close to Elfrida and whispered in German, "What is he giving us? Is it safe?" Elfrida had no answer. The wrapped objects looked like some kind of cake, and the bottles resembled the cola drinks she had seen in photographs of America, but the combination seemed bizarre. Sergeant Pruitt, seemingly oblivious to their hesitation, opened one of the bottles with a metal opener attached to his belt. The cap came off with a satisfying hiss, and he took a long drink before sighing with contentment. "Lord, that's good. Here, Miss Richter, you try one." He held out an unopened bottle to Elfrida. She took it carefully, studying the red and blue label that proclaimed it to be Royal Crown Cola. Private Hobart Lee stepped forward and opened it for her with an opener he produced from his pocket. The first sip was a revelation. The liquid was cold, impossibly cold, and sweet with a strange spicy flavor that fizzed on her tongue. She had tasted something similar once before the war, but nothing quite like this. The carbonation made her nose tingle, and the sweetness cut through the dust in her throat. Before she could stop herself, she took another long drink, and then another. Sergeant Pruitt laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine pleasure at her reaction. "That's right. Nothing like it on a hot day, is there?" He unwrapped one of the round cakes and handed it to her. "Now, try it with this." The moon pie was unlike anything Elfrida had ever encountered. 2 graham-like cookies sandwiched a layer of marshmallow, all covered in chocolate that had softened slightly in the heat. September arrived with marginally cooler temperatures, though the Georgia heat still pressed down like a physical weight most afternoons. The German women had settled into the rhythms of camp life, their initial terror slowly giving way to cautious acceptance. The moon pies and RC colas had become a weekly ritual, something the women found themselves anticipating despite their attempts to maintain emotional distance from their captors. But it was the arrival of Mrs. Paulin Greer and her church ladies that truly began to crack the walls the prisoners had built around themselves. Mrs. Greer was a formidable woman in her early 50s, with steel gray hair pinned in a perfect victory roll and a floral dress that somehow remained crisp despite the humidity. She arrived on a Sunday afternoon in late September with 5 other women from the First Baptist Church, their arms laden with baskets covered in checkered cloths. Captain Booker had approved the visit after weeks of persistent requests from Reverend Floyd Harmon, who had argued that Christian charity knew no national boundaries. Elfrida and the others were called to the recreation hall, a large room with ceiling fans that did little more than push hot air in lazy circles. The German women filed in silently, arranging themselves on one side of the room while the American church ladies set up their baskets on a long table. The 2 groups regarded each other across the space with mutual uncertainty, enemies trying to find common ground in the neutral territory of forced politeness. Mrs. Greer stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "Ladies," she began, speaking slowly and clearly, "we know you're far from home. We know you must be lonely and scared. We can't imagine what you've been through, but we want you to know that here in Georgia, we believe in showing hospitality to strangers. The good book tells us to love our enemies, and while this war has been terrible, we think maybe we can start building some bridges with a shared meal." Elfrida translated haltingly for the others, stumbling over the religious references and the concept of loving one's enemies. The German women exchanged uncertain glances. Was this some kind of trick? But the baskets were being opened now, and the smells that emerged made several stomachs growl audibly. There were fried chicken pieces, still warm and glistening with grease. Biscuits the size of a child's fist, fluffy and golden. Something called collard greens that looked strange but smelled of bacon and onions. Sweet potato pie with perfectly crimped crusts. Deviled eggs sprinkled with paprika. Cornbread studded with actual kernels of corn. "Y'all must be hungry," Mrs. Greer said, gesturing to the food. "Please help yourselves. This is how we welcome folks in the South." Private Hobart Lee began setting out plates and utensils, and Nurse Mildred Tate poured sweet tea into glasses filled with ice. The formality of the setup, the care taken with presentation, suggested this was more than just feeding prisoners. This was an invitation to something deeper. Waltraud was the first to move, drawn by the smell of the fried chicken. She took a piece tentatively, bit into it, and her eyes widened. October brought relief from the worst of the summer heat, and with it, a false sense of peace had settled over Camp Gordon. The German women had grown accustomed to the rhythms of Southern life, the daily offerings of kindness that seemed as natural to these Americans as breathing. Elfrida had begun teaching basic German to some of the guards, while Waltraud assisted Nurse Tate in the medical building. Irmgard helped with administrative work, her precise German handwriting proving useful for camp records. The women laughed more easily now, and some had even begun to adopt Southern phrases, their German accents wrapping around words like y'all and mighty in ways that made the guards grin. But on October 12th, everything changed. Captain Booker called an unusual assembly in the recreation hall. His face was grave, lacking the easy warmth the women had grown used to seeing. Sergeant Pruitt stood beside him, his jaw tight. Even Private Hobart Lee, who seemed incapable of frowning, looked somber. The German women filed in, sensing immediately that something was wrong. They arranged themselves in their usual rows, military discipline reasserting itself in the face of uncertainty. "Ladies," Captain Booker began, his voice careful and measured, "I've received reports from Europe, information that I believe you have a right to know, even though it's going to be difficult to hear." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "Our forces have been liberating areas in Germany and Poland. They've discovered camps, concentration camps, where civilians were imprisoned and killed. The numbers are staggering. The conditions are beyond anything we imagined." Elfrida's hands gripped the edge of her seat. She translated automatically, her voice mechanical, but her mind struggled to process the words. Concentration camps. She had heard whispers of labor camps, places where enemies of the Reich were sent to work. But killed? Civilians? The captain continued, describing places with names she had never heard. Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz. He spoke of gas chambers disguised as showers, of mass graves, of people worked and starved to death, of children, thousands upon thousands of children, murdered for no reason other than their heritage. Beside Elfrida, Waltraud had gone completely white. Christa Bergman shook her head slowly, repeatedly, as if the motion could negate the words filling the room. Adelheid Wagner began to cry silently, tears streaming down her face without sound. Captain Booker's voice remained steady, compassionate, but unflinching. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know the truth about what was done in your country's name. I don't believe you knew about this. I don't think most Germans knew, but now you do know, and you'll have to decide what that means for you." He held up newspapers, American publications with photographs that made several women gasp. The images were grainy but clear enough. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms staring at cameras with hollow eyes. Piles of bodies stacked like cordwood. Children's shoes collected in massive heaps. Ovens. The captain didn't force them to look closely, but he left the newspapers on the table for anyone who wanted to see more. The room erupted in German, voices overlapping in denial, confusion, and horror. "This is propaganda," Christa insisted, her voice shrill. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived with church bells ringing across Georgia and celebrations erupting in every American town and city. At Camp Gordon, the mood was more subdued, complicated by the presence of 32 German women who had just learned that their country had surrendered unconditionally. The war that had defined their lives, that had given them purpose and identity, was over. Germany had lost, and the homeland they remembered no longer existed. Elfrida sat on her bunk in the late afternoon listening to the distant sounds of celebration drifting from the nearby town. Fireworks popped in the distance, and she could hear singing, the kind of joyous noise that came from people who had waited years for this moment. She felt hollow, emptied of everything she had once believed in. The newspapers had continued to arrive throughout the winter and spring, each one bringing fresh horrors from the liberated camps. She had read every article, forced herself to look at every photograph, punishing herself with the truth of what had been done in Germany's name. Waltraud entered the barracks carrying a tray from the mess hall. "You need to eat something," she said in German, setting down a plate of food that Elfrida barely glanced at. "Starving yourself won't change anything that happened." The nurse sat down beside her friend, and for a long moment, they simply existed in shared silence. Over the past 7 months, these women had formed bonds deeper than friendship. They were survivors of a different kind of war, one fought not with weapons but with the gradual destruction of everything they had thought they understood about themselves. "What do we go back to?" Elfrida finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "My family lived in Hamburg. The reports say it's been bombed into rubble. I haven't heard from my mother or my sister in over a year. They could be dead. They probably are dead." She looked at Waltraud with eyes that had seen too much. "And even if they're alive, what do I say to them? That I was captured by the Americans and they fed me moon pies and fried chicken while our country committed genocide? Waltraud had no answer. Her own family had been in Dresden, a city that had been firebombed into ash. The Red Cross had confirmed that her parents and younger brother had not survived. She was returning to a country where she had no one, to cities that no longer stood, to a culture that would be forever stained by the revelations of the camps. The dream of home that had sustained her through the early months of captivity had curdled into something closer to dread. Captain Booker had called another assembly for the following morning to discuss repatriation procedures. The women would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to make their way back to whatever remained of their homes. The Geneva Convention guaranteed their return, but it could not guarantee what they would find when they got there. That evening, Sergeant Pruitt found Elfrida sitting alone under the oak trees where they had first tasted moon pies months earlier. He carried 2 RC colas and sat down beside her without asking permission, opening both bottles and handing her one. The morning assembly on May 9th began with the same formal structure that had governed camp life for the past 9 months. But there was a tension in the air that made even Captain Booker seem uncertain. The German women filed into the recreation hall and took their seats, their faces reflecting a mixture of resignation and anxiety. Sergeant Pruitt stood near the door, his usual easy demeanor replaced by something more solemn. Nurse Mildred Tate sat with her hands folded in her lap, and Private Hobart Lee shifted his weight from foot to foot, unable to stand still. Captain Booker rose and addressed the assembled women with the official documents in his hands. "Ladies, I have received orders from the War Department regarding your repatriation to Germany. Within the next 3 weeks, transportation will be arranged to take you to a port in New York. From there, you'll be shipped to displaced persons camps in Europe, where you'll be processed and eventually released to return to your homes." He paused, looking at each face before him. "I know this news brings mixed feelings. You've been here long enough to become part of our community, and I want you to know that your conduct has been exemplary. You've worked hard, learned our language, and shown tremendous character in the face of difficult truths." The women sat in silence, absorbing the reality of what was coming. In 3 weeks, they would board a ship and sail away from this strange place that had shown them more kindness than they had ever expected to find in enemy territory. They would return to a defeated, occupied Germany, to cities in ruins and a culture in disgrace. They would return as failed soldiers, women who had been captured, and worse, changed by their captors. Elfrida stood slowly, her legs trembling, but her voice steady. "Captain Booker, may I speak?" The captain nodded, surprise evident on his face. Elfrida looked around at her fellow prisoners, meeting the eyes of Waltraud, Irmgard, Carista, and Adelheid. They had discussed this possibility in whispered conversations late at night, debating whether such a request was even conceivable. But standing here now, facing the reality of repatriation, Elfrida found a courage she didn't know she possessed. "Captain, some of us have been talking," she began, her English now nearly fluent after months of daily practice. "We understand that we are prisoners of war and that the Geneva Convention requires our return to Germany. But we want to ask if there is any possibility, any way at all, that some of us might be allowed to stay in America." The words hung in the air like something physical. Captain Booker's eyes widened, and Sergeant Pruitt straightened from his position by the door. Even the German women, who had not been part of the discussions, looked shocked. Waltraud stood next, followed by Irmgard, Adelheid, and 7 other women. 11 women in total, nearly a third of the camp's prisoners, had made the decision to ask for the impossible. "We know what we are asking is unusual," Waltraud said in her careful English, "but Germany is not our home anymore. The Germany we believed we were serving does not exist. Perhaps it never did. What we discovered here in Georgia, the kindness and dignity we have been shown, this feels more like home than anything waiting for us across the ocean." Krista spoke next, her voice thick with emotion. I have no family left in Germany. My parents and 2 sisters died in the bombing of Berlin. The news of the German women's unprecedented request spread through the local communities surrounding Camp Gordon like wildfire through dry Georgia pine. Within days, the story had been picked up by newspapers as far away as Atlanta and Savannah, with headlines ranging from sympathetic to scandalized. Captain Booker had sent urgent communications to his superiors in Washington, but while military bureaucracy ground slowly forward, the debate raged in churches, general stores, and around dinner tables throughout the county. Reverend Floyd Harmon stood before his congregation on the Sunday following the women's request, his Bible open to the parable of the Good Samaritan. The First Baptist Church was packed, with extra chairs brought in to accommodate the overflow crowd. Everyone knew what the sermon would address. Mrs. Pauline Greer sat in her usual pew, her back straight and her face composed, but her hands gripped her hymnal with white-knuckled intensity. Her husband, Jasper Greer, sat beside her, his weathered farmer's face thoughtful as he listened to the Reverend speak. "The question before us today," Reverend Harmon said, his voice carrying to every corner of the church, "is not about politics or military strategy. It's about what kind of people we are when the shooting stops. These German women came here as our enemies. That's true. Their country committed unspeakable evils. That's also true. But they are individuals who have shown genuine remorse, who have worked hard, and who have asked for the chance to build new lives based on better principles than the ones they were taught." He paused, letting his words settle. "The question is whether we believe in redemption, whether we believe people can change, whether we believe that forgiveness is more than just a word we say in our prayers." Not everyone in the congregation agreed. Harold Mitchell, who had lost his son at Normandy, stood up from his pew, his face flushed with anger. "Reverend, with all due respect, my boy died fighting those people. How can you ask us to welcome them into our community like nothing happened? My son is buried in France, and these women want to stay here and live free? Where's the justice in that?" His voice cracked on the last words, and several people nodded in agreement. The pain in the room was palpable, the wounds of war still raw and bleeding. Mrs. Greer stood then, her voice calm but firm. "Harold, I understand your pain. We all do. Every family in this church has been touched by this war, but your son didn't die so we could become the kind of people who turn away from those seeking redemption. He died fighting evil, fighting the Nazi regime, and everything it stood for. These women have rejected that regime. They've seen the truth and been horrified by it. Turning them away now, sending them back to nothing, what does that accomplish except more suffering?" The debate continued in the church and spilled out into the churchyard afterward, with clusters of people arguing passionately on both sides. Some saw the women's request as an insult to American soldiers who had died fighting Germany. Others saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate American values of forgiveness and second chances. Still others worried about practical matters, about jobs and housing, and whether former enemy nationals could ever truly integrate into Southern society. At the county courthouse, a formal meeting was convened to discuss the community's position. The letter from Washington arrived on June 3, 1945, and its contents were as unprecedented as the request that had prompted it. Due to the extraordinary circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, the War Department had agreed to reclassify the 11 women as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. They would not be forced to return immediately, but they would need local sponsors, employment, and housing. The decision shifted the burden from military authorities to the communities themselves. Mrs. Pauline Greer had been waiting for exactly this outcome. Within hours of Captain Booker's announcement, she arrived at the camp with a formal sponsorship offer for Elfrida Richter. The Greers would provide housing in a small cottage on their property and help Elfrida find employment as a translator and German tutor. Mr. Jasper Greer, despite his initial reservations, had been convinced by his wife's passionate arguments about Christian charity and the opportunity to demonstrate what American values truly meant. Waltraud found her sponsor in an unexpected place. Dr. Henry Morrison, who ran the county hospital, had been impressed by nurse Mildred Tate's reports of Waltraud's medical skills and dedication. He offered to sponsor her continued nursing education and eventual certification in Georgia, providing room and board at the hospital in exchange for her work. It was an opportunity Waltraud had never imagined possible, a chance to continue the healing work that had become her purpose. The other 9 women found similar pathways forward. Irmgard was sponsored by a local business owner who needed help with bookkeeping and correspondence. Adelheid began working with the school system, teaching German to students while learning the intricacies of Southern culture and education. Each woman was paired with families who had decided that forgiveness was more powerful than continued enmity. But the transition was far from simple. When Elfrida moved into the cottage on the Greer property in late June, she encountered stares and whispers whenever she accompanied Mrs. Greer into town. Some shopkeepers served her with cold politeness. Others refused her business entirely. Children pointed and whispered, "Nazi lady," as she passed. The weight of her country's sins followed her like a shadow she could never quite escape. Mrs. Greer refused to let the hostility stand unchallenged. When the owner of the general store told Elfrida her money was no good there, Mrs. Greer marched up to the counter and announced loudly that if Elfrida wasn't welcome, then neither was the Greer family's business. 3 other customers followed her out in solidarity. Within a week, the store owner had quietly reversed his policy. Slowly, grudgingly, the community began to shift. When Elfrida started teaching German classes at the high school that fall, only 5 students enrolled initially. By Christmas, the class had grown to 18. When Waltraud assisted in delivering Mrs. Patterson's baby during a difficult breech birth, saving both mother and child, the story spread through the county like kudzu. 27 years after that sweltering August day when Elfrida Richter first stepped off a transport truck into the Georgia heat, she stood in the same recreation hall at what was now a decommissioned military site. The building had been converted into a community center, but she could still see the room as it had been in 1944, filled with frightened German women and curious American guards trying to bridge an impossible divide. Today, the hall was packed with people gathered for a very different purpose, a reunion commemorating the unprecedented story of former enemies who had become neighbors, friends, and family. Waltraud Morrison stood beside her, no longer Waltraud Schmidt, but the wife of Private Hobart Lee, who had traded his private title for Mr. and his military service for a career as a rural mail carrier. They had married in 1948, scandalizing some and inspiring others with their proof that love could transcend the boundaries of war. Waltraud had become Dr. Waltraud Morrison 5 years ago, the first female physician at County General Hospital, and her reputation for compassionate care had erased nearly all remnants of hostility toward her German origins. Elfrida had married as well, though not until 1953, wedding a widowed schoolteacher named Robert Henderson, who had seen past her accent and her history to the woman she had become. They had 2 children now, teenagers who spoke English with Southern drawls and German with their mother's careful pronunciation. Her work as a translator had expanded over the years, and she now worked with the State Department, helping to process the continuing stream of European refugees seeking new lives in America. Of the 11 women who had chosen to stay, 9 were present today. 2 had passed away, one from cancer and another in a car accident, but their families attended in their honor. Irmgard Neumann Davis stood with her husband and 4 children. Adelheid Wegner Phillips had become a beloved high school principal. Krista Bergman had never married, but had built a successful career as a mechanical engineer, one of the first women in Georgia to do so. Each woman had found her own path, but they remained bound together by the shared experience of transformation. The current mayor of the town, who had been a child during the war years, stepped to the podium. "We're here today to honor a story that could only happen in America," he began. "The story of enemies who became friends, of prisoners who became citizens, of a community that chose forgiveness over hatred. He gestured to a display that had been set up along one wall, photographs from the camp years showing young women in faded gray uniforms gradually transforming into integrated members of the community. But the centerpiece of the display made everyone smile. It was a carefully preserved original moon pie wrapper and an empty RC Cola bottle from 1944, donated by Sergeant Otis Pruitt's family after his death in 1968. Beside them was a photograph of that first day when Sergeant Pruitt had introduced the skeptical German prisoners to the quintessential Southern treat. The image captured Elfrida's face in the moment of her first sip, surprise and delight breaking through her carefully maintained composure. Mrs. Pauline Greer, now 83 years old but still sharp as a tack, stood to speak.